Welcome back to another deep dive into the vast universe of Dune. Tonight, we're exploring one of the most fascinating yet often overlooked power structures in Frank Herbert's masterwork. Not the great houses with their armies and ancestral feuds, not the Bene Gesserit with their genetic programs and political machinations. Not even the Padishah Emperor sitting on the golden lion throne. No, tonight, we're talking about the organization that made all of these powers possible. The entity without which the entire Imperium would collapse into isolated worlds spinning alone in the darkness. We're talking about the Spacing Guild, the silent architects of an interstellar civilization, the merchants of distance itself. Before we fold space and jump into this journey, if you enjoy these explorations of science fiction's deepest corners, hitting that subscribe button really helps the channel grow and lets me know you want more content like this. Now, settle in as we unravel the story of the organization that controlled the cosmos not through conquest, but through contracts. Not through violence, but through the simple, terrifying monopoly on the one thing that mattered most in a scattered empire: the ability to go anywhere at all. The invisible empire. There's a peculiar kind of power that exists in the Dune universe, one that operates in the shadows of thrones and palaces, one that never announces itself with fanfares or proclamations. It's the power of the Spacing Guild, and understanding it means understanding how the entire political and economic structure of Herbert's universe functions at its most fundamental level. Imagine, if you will, an organization so essential to daily life that its very existence becomes invisible. You don't think about it. You don't question it. It simply is. The way gravity is, the way breathing is. The Spacing Guild achieved something remarkable in the 10,000 years of the Carino Empire. They made themselves as necessary as oxygen, and just as unnoticed until the moment you couldn't access it anymore. The Guild's monopoly on interstellar travel wasn't maintained through military might. They had no legions of warriors, no planet-destroying weapons, no Sardaukar shock troops. Their power was something far more elegant and far more absolute. They controlled the only method by which anyone or anything could travel between star systems. Every ship that left a planet's orbit and journeyed to another world did so inside a guild highliner. Every trade good, every diplomatic envoy, every military force, every pilgrim and merchant and spy, all of them depended on the Guild's willingness to provide transport. This dependence created a unique political equilibrium. The Imperium was often described as a three-legged stool. The Emperor, the great houses of the Landsraad, and the Spacing Guild. Remove any one leg and the whole structure would collapse. But of these three, the Guild was perhaps the most crucial, because without them, the other two couldn't even communicate, much less govern or war with each other. The Guild was essentially apolitical. They had no interest in territory, no dynastic ambitions, no desire to sit on thrones or rule populations. Their concerns were purely economic. the flow of commerce, the preservation of the economy that supported their operations, the steady accumulation of wealth that came from being the sole provider of an absolutely essential service. They influenced political events, certainly, through their ability to dictate terms and fees for transport. But they pursued no political goals beyond their economic interests. This neutrality was both genuine and calculated. Paul Atreides himself concluded that the Guild maintained this stance out of a profound philosophical understanding. Any political empire is finite. Dynasties rise and fall. Houses ascend and crumble. Emperors are overthrown. But if you position yourself not as a player in the game, but as the board itself, not as a dynasty, but as the infrastructure that allows dynasties to exist, then you achieve a form of immortality that no throne can offer. The Guild was a parasite, but in the ecological sense rather than the pejorative one. They sustained themselves by attaching to the body politic, sipping from its vitality but never draining it dry, always careful to keep the host alive and healthy, because their own existence depended on it. When one imperial house fell, the Guild simply shifted their support to the next. When the political landscape transformed, they adapted. They had no ideology to defend, no sacred traditions that couldn't be compromised. They had only one imperative: maintain the monopoly, ensure the spice flows, keep the navigators supplied, and the rest would take care of itself. But this apparent simplicity concealed layers of complexity. The Guild's power rested on three pillars: the technology of the Holtzman drive, the prescient abilities of their navigators, and the spice melange that made those abilities possible. Each of these was both a source of strength and a potential vulnerability. The drive technology was closely guarded, its principles known only to Guild technicians. The navigators were kept hidden from public view, their mutation into something barely recognizable as human a carefully protected secret. And the spice, that golden cinnamon-scented powder found only on Arrakis, was simultaneously their greatest asset and their most dangerous weakness. To understand the Guild's power, we must trace its origins, explore the terrible transformation that its navigators underwent, examine the engineering marvel of the Highliners themselves, and finally confront the moment when a young man with strange blue eyes figured out how to bring the entire edifice crashing down by threatening the one thing the Guild could not afford to lose. The birth of necessity, origins, and the Holtzman effect. The story of the Spacing Guild begins in the ashes of humanity's greatest trauma, the Butlerian Jihad. For generations, thinking machines had ruled over human civilization, their cold logic making decisions that shaped billions of lives. The Jihad was humanity's violent revolt against this domination, a crusade that ended with the destruction of all computers, all artificial intelligences, all machines that could think and reason. In the aftermath, humanity faced a crisis. The ban on thinking machines was absolute, codified in the religious commandment that would echo through millennia. Thou shalt not make a machine in the likeness of a human mind. But the functions that these machines had performed didn't disappear with their destruction. Someone or something had to replace them. This necessity gave birth to what were called the Great Schools. The Bene Gesserit with their genetic programs and mental disciplines, the Mentats with their human-computer capabilities, and the Spacing Guild with their prescient navigators. Space travel had existed before the Jihad, of course. Humanity had already spread across multiple star systems, using faster-than-light drives that could outrace photons, crossing the gulf between stars in weeks or months rather than centuries. But this conventional FTL travel, while effective, was slow by the standards of an expanding civilization. You could cross between nearby stars, but administering an empire of thousands of worlds required something faster, something that could move ships not through space, but around it. The breakthrough came from a woman named Norma Senva, though her name would be largely forgotten by history, overshadowed by T.O. Holtzman, the scientist who took credit for much of her work. Norma was a mathematical genius, and she recognized that a scientific principle Holtzman had discovered, the Holtzman effect, could be applied in ways its namesake had never imagined. The Holtzman effect dealt with the repellent force of subatomic particles. It had already been adapted to create defensive shields that could turn aside fast-moving projectiles while allowing slow-moving objects like knives to pass through. But Norma saw something more profound in the mathematics. The effect could be used to fold space itself at the quantum level, creating a condition where a ship could be in one place and then, without actually moving through the intervening distance, be somewhere else entirely. Imagine space-time as a piece of paper. Conventional travel meant crawling like an ant across the surface from one point to another. What Norma discovered was that you could fold the paper, bringing two distant points into contact, and simply step across. The ship wouldn't travel through space in any meaningful sense. Space would move around the ship, or the ship would slip through a crease in reality into a quantum state where distance became meaningless. She called it fold space travel, and it was revolutionary. A journey that might have taken months with conventional drives could now be accomplished instantaneously. The economic and military implications were staggering. Whoever controlled this technology would control human civilization itself. But there was a problem, and it was a significant one. The quantum nature of fold space was chaotic, unpredictable, seemingly non-deterministic. The mathematics involved in plotting a safe course through folded space were absurdly complex. The calculations needed to account for gravitational hazards to ensure the ship emerged from fold space in the right location and not, say, inside a planet or star, required computational power that only thinking machines possessed. And thinking machines were now absolutely forbidden. The early attempts at fold space travel were catastrophic. Without proper navigation, roughly 1 in 10 ships simply disappeared, lost in the quantum foam, their crews and cargo scattered across dimensions that human senses couldn't perceive. A 10% failure rate was acceptable for experimental research, but it made fold space travel commercially and militarily impractical. You couldn't build an empire on a transport system that destroyed 1 of every 10 shipments. Norma Senva solved this problem through an act of desperate innovation and self-sacrifice. She realized that the spice melange, the strange substance found only on Arrakis, had properties that went beyond its known effects of extending life and heightening awareness. In massive, concentrated doses, the spice granted a form of limited prescience, the ability to perceive probable futures, to see paths through time and space that normal human cognition couldn't grasp. In the year 88 before Guild, Norma immersed herself in spice gas, saturating her body and mind with melange until she achieved a state of consciousness that was barely human. And in that transformed state, she could see the paths through fold space. She could perceive the dangers, the gravitational wells, the points where quantum instability would tear a ship apart. She could guide vessels through the chaos safely, intuitively calculating probabilities that would have required thinking machines to express in mathematical notation. Norma Senva became the first navigator. And with her transformation, the fold space travel problem was solved. Humans enhanced by spice could replace the forbidden computers. The success rate of fold space jumps went from 90% to effectively 100%, and an organization began to form around this breakthrough. Norma's partner, Aurelius Venport, was an entrepreneur, a man who understood markets and monopolies. He founded the Fold Space Shipping Company, which would eventually become Venhold, and finally evolve into the Spacing Guild. The business model was elegant in its simplicity. They would train humans to become navigators through spice saturation, build enormous ships called highliners that could carry massive amounts of cargo and passengers, and charge fees for transport that reflected the fact that they were, gradually but inexorably, the only organization that could safely provide this service. Other companies tried to compete. Celestial Transport, Escontran, various smaller operations attempted to break into the fold space market, but they lacked the key ingredient: navigators. The process of creating a navigator was a closely guarded secret, known only to Venhold. Without navigators, these rival companies had to rely on less reliable methods, and their 10% failure rate made them gradually uncompetitive. Ships disappeared, cargoes were lost, insurance costs skyrocketed. One by one, the competitors failed or were absorbed. By the time of the Great Convention, which established the political framework of the Imperium, the Guild's monopoly was essentially complete. They set the starting point of the imperial calendar at year 1 after Guild, marking their emergence as a serious political and economic force. The Emperor recognized the Guild officially. The great houses of the Landsraad accepted their terms, and the Guild, for its part, agreed to maintain strict neutrality, to serve all parties equally, to function as a utility rather than a political actor. It was an arrangement that would last for 10,000 years. an epoch of human history during which the Guild became so thoroughly integrated into the fabric of civilization that imagining life without them became nearly impossible. But the cost of maintaining this monopoly was high, and it was paid not in money, but in humanity itself, by the individuals who underwent the transformation to become navigators. The price of prescience, becoming a navigator. To become a navigator was to achieve the pinnacle of Guild ambition. It was the highest rank, the most prestigious position, the role that every guildsman aspired to. But it was also a transformation so profound, so irreversible, and so physically devastating that calling it a career choice seems almost obscene. It was more like a form of willing metamorphosis, a conscious decision to become something other than human in service of a function that only posthumans could perform. The process began with selection. Not everyone could become a navigator. The Guild looked for certain qualities, intelligence certainly, but also a particular cast of mind, a flexibility of perception, an ability to think in multiple dimensions simultaneously. Mentats could perform logical calculations with superhuman speed, but navigators needed something different. They needed to be able to perceive probability, to hold multiple potential futures in their mind at once, to navigate not just through space, but through time's branching possibilities. Once selected, the candidate would begin intensive training in Guild facilities. They would learn the principles of fold space travel, study the mathematics of the Holtzman drive, practice the mental disciplines required to process vast amounts of sensory data simultaneously. But this was just preparation. The real transformation came when they entered the tanks. The navigator tanks were rectangular chambers filled with orange spice gas, suspended in microgravity. The candidates would be placed in these tanks and begin consuming melange in quantities that would kill an ordinary person. They would breathe it, drink it, absorb it through their skin. The spice would saturate every cell of their body, altering their metabolism, changing their biochemistry at a fundamental level. The first sign of transformation was always the eyes. All heavy spice users developed what was called the eyes of Ebot, or blue in blue, a condition where the sclera and iris became tinted with such a deep blue it appeared almost black. This was common enough that it could be hidden with contact lenses for those who needed to maintain a normal appearance. But for navigators, the eye change was just the beginning. As months turned into years of continuous spice saturation, their bodies began to mutate in ways that were both grotesque and strangely suited to their function. Their limbs elongated, becoming thin and spindly. Their hands and feet developed webbing, giving them a vaguely aquatic appearance. Some descriptions compared them to humanoid fish swimming in a strange sea. Their organs repositioned themselves within their body cavity, adapting to the constant microgravity and the altered oxygen requirements of their changed metabolism. Most disturbing were the changes to their face and head. Their mouths became tiny V-shaped slits. Their noses atrophied to ugly flaps of cartilage, but their heads grew enormous, the skull expanding to accommodate a brain that was processing information at levels normal humans couldn't comprehend. Their temples pulsed visibly with what seemed like the rhythm of space and time itself, beating to a tempo that existed beyond conventional perception. Their voices changed too, becoming sing-song ululations that required mechanical translation devices to render into comprehensible Galak, the common language of the Imperium. The sounds they made were barely recognizable as human speech, more like whale songs or the creaking of deep ocean trenches, communication from beings who had left humanity's shores behind. And through all of this transformation, they remained conscious. They were aware of what was happening to them. The process wasn't instantaneous, wasn't something that could be done to an unconscious patient. They had to participate in their own metamorphosis, had to will themselves through each stage of change, had to embrace the loss of their human form in exchange for the prescient awareness that would make them navigators. The psychological impact was profound. They developed a form of limited prescience that was focused specifically on their function. They could see through space and time, perceive gravitational hazards light years away, predict the movements of celestial bodies with perfect accuracy. They could glimpse probable futures and choose the safest path through quantum uncertainty. But this awareness came at the cost of their connection to normal human experience. They no longer cared about taste, touch, or the smell of anything except spice. Food became irrelevant. They sustained themselves on melange alone. Physical pleasures meant nothing to beings whose consciousness existed partially outside conventional space-time. They were aware of every note in what one observer called the pavine, the music of the spheres, the fundamental vibrations of reality itself. They swayed to rhythms that normal humans couldn't hear, conducted by forces that normal humans couldn't perceive. They became utterly dependent on spice. Withdrawal would kill them within hours, their altered metabolism collapsing without the constant infusion of melange. They needed their tanks, their spice gas, their carefully controlled environment. They were confined to their chambers for the rest of their lives, which, maintained by the spice, could extend for centuries. They were effectively immortal as long as the conditions were maintained, but they had sacrificed mobility, physical form, and arguably their humanity to achieve it. The guild was fanatically protective of its navigators. Duke Leto Atreides noted that the guild was as jealous of its privacy as it was of its monopoly, that not even guild agents ever saw navigators directly. The mutation was kept secret, hidden behind intermediaries and ambassadors who presented a human face to the universe, while the navigators themselves remained sequestered in their tanks, seeing everything, but seen by almost no one. Why would anyone choose this transformation? The question haunted many who learned the truth about navigators. The answer had layers. First, there was the promise of power and prestige. To be a navigator was to be among the most important humans alive, essential to the functioning of civilization itself. Second, there was wealth. The guild's monopoly made it unimaginably rich, and navigators shared in this prosperity. They had access to every comfort, every luxury that money could buy, even if their transformed state left them unable to appreciate most pleasures. But perhaps the deepest motivation was the experience itself. Those who became navigators reported that the prescient state was transcendent, beyond any ability to describe. They experienced reality in dimensions that normal consciousness couldn't access. They were no longer constrained by linear time, no longer bound to a single viewpoint in space. They became, in a sense, cosmic beings, perceiving the universe from a perspective that was almost godlike. One account described it beautifully. The lifelong experience of the steersman, breathing in and drinking melange, rocking to the beat of space and time, swaying with the music of the spheres, led in their dance by the pulse of life around them, alive to every note in the pavine, both composed and played by. Their quartet is beyond the power of words to describe, or the imagination to conceive. For those who chose this path, the loss of their human form was not a tragedy, but a transcendence. They became what humanity would be if it could evolve past its biological limitations. They touched infinity, and the price of that touch was merely everything that made them recognizably human. But whether this was a fair trade, whether the experience justified the sacrifice, was a question that only the navigators themselves could answer. And they, swimming in their tanks of orange gas, seeing paths through dimensions that normal humans couldn't imagine, were no longer quite human enough to explain it in terms the rest of humanity could understand. Mountains in the void. The Highliners. If the navigators were the guild's most guarded secret, the Highliners were its most visible symbol of power. These ships were monuments to the ambitions of an interstellar civilization, so massive that the human mind struggled to grasp their true scale. They were cities in space, artificial worlds, monuments of engineering that dwarfed everything else humanity had built. Duke Leto Atreides tried to explain their size to his son, Paul. A Highliner is truly big. Its hold will tuck all our frigates and transports into a little corner. We'll be just a small part of the ship's manifest. This wasn't hyperbole. A single Highliner could be 20 kilometers or more in length, taller than the greatest mountains, wider than the grandest canyons. The ships depicted in the 2021 film adaptation by Denis Villeneuve captured something of this scale, showing them as enormous cylindrical structures that seemed less like vehicles and more like mobile space stations, portals that hung in orbit like God-built doorways between worlds. But size was only part of what made Highliners remarkable. Their design reflected their unique method of propulsion. They didn't move through space in any conventional sense. They didn't have engines that pushed them forward, no thrusters that could maneuver something so massive. Instead, they employed the Holtzman drive to fold space around them, to slip from one point in the universe to another without traversing the distance between. This meant they operated very differently from other spacecraft. A highliner would take up a parking orbit around a planet. Smaller ships, frigates, transports, personal craft, all would launch from the planet's surface and fly up into the highliner's enormous hold. The interior of a highliner was essentially a vast parking garage, capable of holding entire fleets of conventional spacecraft. Some reports suggested that enemy fleets could be inside the same highliner without being able to fire on each other, separated by sheer distance within the ship's cavernous interior. Once loaded, the highliner would activate its Holtzman drive. Space would fold. Quantum fluctuations would cascade through dimensions normal sensors couldn't detect, and the ship would simply be elsewhere. The journey was instantaneous from the perspective of those inside. One moment orbiting Caladan, the next moment orbiting Arrakis, hundreds of light years away, with no subjective passage of time. The hold would open again, and the smaller ships would depart, flying down to the planetary surface, while the highliner remained in orbit, waiting for the next manifest, the next collection of passengers and cargo that needed transport. A single highliner could service multiple worlds in a matter of days, jumping from system to system, an endlessly cycling hub in the Guild's vast transportation network. The Guild maintained a fleet of these vessels, though the exact number was closely held information. Some sources suggested no more than 5,000 highliners existed at the height of Guild power. This seems like a small number until you consider their capacity. Each one could transport goods and passengers equivalent to an entire planet's worth of commerce. 5,000 highliners, properly scheduled and routed, could handle the needs of an empire of thousands of worlds. The ships were legendary for their durability. They were built to last centuries, perhaps millennia, with minimal maintenance. The technology was deliberately designed to be essentially immune to obsolescence. The Guild protected its investments, and no highliner was known to have been destroyed by accident or enemy action during the 10,000 years of Guild dominance. They were sacred, in a sense, protected by laws and customs that made them inviolable. The Great Convention, the set of rules that governed warfare among the great houses, included special provisions for highliners. They were considered neutral territory, spaces where the normal rules of war did not apply. Acts of violence aboard a highliner carried severe penalties, because damaging a Guild ship meant damaging the infrastructure that all parties, even enemies, depended upon. You could wage war against a rival house, could destroy their armies and burn their worlds, but you didn't touch the highliners. That was a line that no one crossed, because everyone understood that crossing it would bring the entire system crashing down. This neutrality gave the Guild tremendous leverage in political disputes. Houses in danger of ruin or defeat could contract with the Guild to be removed to a place of safety outside the system. A house facing destruction could essentially evacuate, taking their atomics and shields and whatever they could salvage and flee beyond the Imperium's borders. The Guild would transport them, no questions asked, because the Guild served all who could pay their fees. The economic implications of this transport monopoly were staggering. Every trade good that moved between worlds paid guild fees. Every diplomatic mission, every military deployment, every pilgrimage and migration and business trip, all of it generated revenue for the guild. They didn't just control transportation, they controlled interplanetary banking as well, managing the flow of money that paralleled the flow of ships. The fees were exorbitant, reflecting the monopoly status. The guild could dictate terms, and everyone paid because there was no alternative. Need to move an army to another world? Pay the guild. Need to import food to a starving planet? Pay the guild. Need to send a message that couldn't wait for conventional communications? Send a courier by Highliner and pay the guild. This wealth accumulation made the guild arguably the richest organization in human history. They had resources that dwarfed individual great houses, that rivaled even the imperial treasury. But they didn't use this wealth for conquest or expansion. They reinvested it in their operations, in building more Highliners, in training more navigators, in refining their techniques, in ensuring that their monopoly remained absolute and their service remained essential. The guild's power was so pervasive that it became invisible. People took it for granted the way they took air for granted. You wanted to travel? You booked passage on a Highliner. You wanted to ship goods? You contracted with the guild. It was as natural as breathing, as inevitable as gravity. The system worked so well, so smoothly, that questioning it seemed almost absurd. But this very success contained the seeds of vulnerability. The guild's power rested on the unspoken assumption that the monopoly was permanent, that the underlying technology and resources would always remain under their control. They had made themselves indispensable. But indispensability is only valuable if what you provide can't be replaced, and if the resources you depend on can't be threatened. The Highliners themselves were invulnerable, yes, but the navigators who guided them were not. And those navigators depended absolutely on a substance found on a single planet, under the control of whoever ruled that planet. The guild had built their empire on a foundation that seemed unshakable. But even the greatest mountains can erode if you know where to dig. The three-legged stool, political power and balance. The political structure of the Imperium was often compared to a three-legged stool, a metaphor that captured both its stability and its fragility. The three legs were the Padishah Emperor, the great houses of the Landsrat, and the Spacing Guild. Remove any one leg and the stool would collapse. But understanding how these powers balanced against each other required examining not just their obvious strengths, but their hidden vulnerabilities and unspoken agreements. The Emperor held the title of Supreme Ruler, but his power was far from absolute. He commanded the Sardaukar, the most feared military force in the known universe. Soldiers raised on the prison planet Seleucia Secundus, where only the strongest survived. The Sardaukar gave the Emperor the ability to project force, to enforce his will, to punish houses that stepped too far out of line. But even the Sardaukar couldn't be everywhere at once, couldn't garrison every world, couldn't fight every house simultaneously. The Landsraad, the collective assembly of the great houses, represented a different kind of power, numbers and economic weight. Individually, most great houses couldn't match the emperor's military might, but collectively, if they unified, they could potentially overwhelm even the Sardaukar. The Landsraad's power was the power of coalition, of political maneuvering, of economic pressure applied through CHOAM, the Combine Honet Ober Advancer Mercantiles, the Universal Commerce Corporation in which every house held shares. And then there was the Guild. They had no armies. They owned no planets. They didn't participate directly in the political machinations of great houses or the court intrigue of the imperial palace, but they controlled movement itself, and in an empire scattered across thousands of light years, movement was everything. The emperor couldn't wage war without guild transport to move his Sardaukar. The great houses couldn't trade without guild ships to carry their goods. The entire political and economic structure of the Imperium depended on the guild's continued willingness to provide service. This gave them veto power over almost any action taken by any other party. If the guild disagreed with a policy, they didn't need to fight. They simply raised their fees. If they strongly disagreed, they could refuse service entirely, stranding armies, isolating worlds, cutting off trade routes. The implicit threat of this power kept everyone in line, ensured that no faction pushed too hard, grabbed too much, upset the balance so thoroughly that the guild felt compelled to intervene. But the guild's power had limits, and they understood those limits perfectly. They could threaten to withhold service, but actually doing so would damage the economy they depended on. They could raise fees, but only so far before they sparked rebellion or made their monopoly politically untenable. They operated within boundaries set by practical considerations and political wisdom. This is why they never attempted to rule directly. Paul Atreides, with his prescient vision, understood this better than most. The guild maintained their parasitic strategy, he realized, because any political empire was finite. Dynasties ended, houses fell, emperors were overthrown. But if you positioned yourself as essential infrastructure rather than as a political player, you could survive regime changes, wait out revolutions, persist through upheavals that destroyed everyone else. The guild watched as the Carino dynasty accepted power over 10,000 years. They watched as great houses rose to prominence and fell into obscurity. They watched as various factions plotted and schemed and occasionally succeeded in temporarily shifting the balance. And through all of this, the guild endured, unchanged, because they understood that their role was to be the board on which the game was played, not a player in the game itself. Their neutrality was carefully cultivated and rigorously maintained. When houses went to war, the guild transported both sides' armies without bias. When political crises erupted, the guild continued normal operations, carrying envoys and diplomats regardless of which faction they served. When the emperor moved against a house, the guild might facilitate that movement, but they would also transport refugees from that house to sanctuary, if properly contracted. This neutrality was enforced by strict internal discipline. Individual guild members might have personal opinions about political events, but the organization as a whole remained impartial. Breaking neutrality would undermine the trust that made the monopoly acceptable. If great houses believed the guild favored certain parties over others, they would seek alternatives, would invest in breaking the monopoly, would unite against what they perceived as partisan interference. The guild's fees reflected their monopoly status. They were high enough to generate massive profits, but not so high as to seem exploitative. The pricing structure was complex, varying based on distance, cargo type, urgency, and market conditions. But there was consistency in how fees were applied. Everyone paid the same rate for equivalent service. The emperor got no special discount. The greatest of the great houses paid no less than the smallest. This equality of treatment was itself a form of political power. It signaled that the guild stood above the normal hierarchy, that they answered to economic logic rather than political pressure. It also meant that no faction could gain advantage over rivals through preferential guild treatment. The playing field, in this one crucial respect, was level. But there were subtle ways the guild exercised influence. They could schedule ships to arrive at politically convenient moments. They could provide faster service to favored clients through priority scheduling rather than discounted fees. They could share information gathered from their vast transport network, dropping hints about troop movements or resource shipments observed during their travels. These minor advantages never crossed the line into partisan action, but they allowed the guild to reward cooperation and punish obstinance without breaking their neutrality. A house that consistently paid late or caused problems might find their shipments delayed by scheduling conflicts. A house that maintained good relations might receive better service through informal accommodations. The guild also participated in the Chom Company, holding significant shares alongside the emperor and great houses. This gave them another lever of influence, another way to affect economic conditions without direct political action. They could vote their shares to support or block initiatives, could advocate for policies that protected their interests, could form coalitions with other shareholders to achieve specific outcomes. Most significantly, the guild possessed information. Their navigators, with their limited prescience, could see farther into the future than almost anyone except the most powerful prescients among the Bene Gesserit. They knew which political movements were likely to succeed or fail. They knew which investments would prosper and which would collapse. they saw nexus points, moments where decisions would have cascading consequences across space and time. This foreknowledge gave them an almost unfair advantage in political and economic maneuvering. They could position themselves perfectly for regime changes, could anticipate and prepare for crises before those crises became apparent to others. They could see the shape of things to come and act accordingly, always staying one step ahead of the political chaos that consumed others. But this prescient vision had a blind spot, a gap in their perception that they didn't fully recognize until it was too late. The navigators could see paths through space and time, could perceive probable futures branching out from present moments. But their vision was focused on their specific function: safe navigation, economic stability, the preservation of the conditions that allowed them to operate. They weren't looking for threats to their fundamental dependency, because that dependency seemed so absolute, so permanent, so beyond challenge that considering it vulnerable would have seemed absurd. The Guild had achieved what every monopoly dreams of: a position so entrenched, so essential, so thoroughly integrated into the fabric of civilization that imagining an alternative became nearly impossible. They were the three-legged stool's most crucial leg, because without them, the Emperor and Landsraad couldn't even reach each other to compete or cooperate. They had made themselves the indispensable infrastructure of empire. But as any student of power understands, being indispensable only matters if your dependencies can't be exploited. The Guild depended on their navigators. The navigators depended on spice. And spice came from exactly one place in the entire universe. This singular dependency was the hairline fracture in the foundation of their power. Invisible under normal circumstances, but capable of bringing the entire edifice crashing down under the right pressure. The Guild knew about this vulnerability, of course. They weren't blind to their own supply chain, but they believed they had managed the risk. Arrakis changed hands periodically between great houses, awarded by the Emperor as a fief to favored families. But whoever held Arrakis understood that disrupting spice production was unthinkable. The Guild would crush any house that threatened the spice flow. The Emperor would destroy any force that endangered melange supplies. The economic catastrophe that would follow a spice shortage would unite every power in the Imperium against whoever caused it. This multi-layered deterrent seemed foolproof. No rational actor would threaten spice production because doing so would be suicide. The Guild built their security on the assumption of rationality, on the belief that everyone understood the rules and would play within them, because breaking the rules meant annihilation. They never seriously considered what would happen if someone appeared who didn't care about annihilation, who saw the destruction of spice not as an unthinkable catastrophe, but as leverage, who understood that the Guild's absolute dependency on melange made that dependency exploitable by anyone willing to threaten what seemed unthreatable. The singular vulnerability, spice dependency. To understand the Guild's greatest weakness, we must first understand the substance at the heart of everything. Melange, the spice, the cinnamon-scented powder that made interstellar civilization possible. It was the most valuable commodity in the known universe, worth more than any precious metal, any gemstone, any manufactured good. Wars were fought over it, fortunes made and lost on it. Entire planetary economies depended on it, but its true value went beyond economics. Melange extended life, sometimes for centuries. It heightened awareness, enhanced memory, amplified mental capabilities. Those who consumed it regularly experienced a gradual increase in their cognitive abilities. It was simultaneously a drug, a medicine, and a consciousness-expanding substance that approached the mystical in its effects. For the Bene Gesserit, small doses of melange enhanced their already formidable mental disciplines. For the Mentats, it improved their computational capabilities. For the wealthy across the Imperium, it promised extended lifespans and heightened vitality. The upper classes were thoroughly addicted, not in the sense of seeking a high, but in the sense of depending on it for health and longevity. Withdrawal meant accelerated aging, diminished capacity, and often death within a relatively short period. But for the guild navigators, spice wasn't an enhancement or a luxury. It was absolute biological necessity. Their bodies, transformed by years of spice saturation, had become fundamentally dependent on constant melange intake. Their mutated metabolism required it to function. Without spice, a navigator would die within hours, their body cannibalizing itself, their mind fragmenting as the prescient awareness that defined their existence collapsed into chaos and then silence. This created an interesting dynamic. The entire Imperium was addicted to spice to varying degrees, but the guild was the most vulnerable because their addiction was immediate and fatal. Everyone else could survive spice withdrawal, even if it meant suffering and shortened lifespans. The navigators simply couldn't. Cut off their supply, and the guild's ability to navigate fold space would evaporate within days as their navigators died. Arrakis, the desert planet, was the sole source of melange in the known universe. The spice was produced through the life cycle of sandworms, enormous creatures that lived beneath the sand, the largest organisms ever encountered by humanity. These beings, some growing to lengths of several hundred meters, processed sand and trace elements through their bodies in a biological cycle that, through mechanisms not fully understood, produced melange as a byproduct. The spice appeared in what were called spice blows, eruptions from beneath the sand, where pressurized spice gases would burst through the surface, creating clouds of cinnamon-scented powder that would settle across the desert. Harvesting spice meant locating these blows before they occurred, or finding the patches of spice left by previous eruptions, and extracting the melange before the vibrations of harvesting equipment attracted sandworms that would destroy the harvesting machinery and kill the workers. It was dangerous work, carried out by tough laborers using specialized equipment designed for rapid deployment and extraction. The harvesters would be lowered from ornithopters, landed on a promising spice field, and begin gathering as much melange as possible before the inevitable worm arrived. When sensors detected the approaching worm, everything would be abandoned or quickly lifted back to the aircraft. Workers who were too slow became meals for creatures large enough to swallow industrial equipment whole. The economics of spice production were brutal. The investment required was enormous. Equipment, personnel, transport, security, infrastructure. The risks were constant. Worms, equipment failure, storms, sabotage. But the profits were astronomical because demand was effectively infinite and supply was constrained by the difficulty of harvesting and the monopoly of Arrakis as the sole source. The Emperor granted Arrakis as a fief to great houses, a rotating assignment that was simultaneously a tremendous opportunity and a poisoned chalice. The house that held Arrakis could become unimaginably wealthy from spice revenues, but they also bore enormous costs and risks. They had to maintain production quotas. They had to defend against rivals seeking to sabotage operations. They had to deal with the Fremen, the desert people who lived on Arrakis and who viewed off-worlders as invaders exploiting their world. For most of Imperial history, Arrakis was held by House Harkonnen, a brutal and efficient family that maximized profits through ruthless exploitation. The Harkonnens treated Arrakis as a resource to be strip-mined, showing no concern for sustainability or the well-being of the native population. They maintained production through fear and violence, running their operations with military precision and aristocratic cruelty. The Guild, watching all of this, had concerns, but not fears. Spice production fluctuated slightly based on which house held the fief, but it never stopped. Entirely. No one would dare interrupt the spice flow. The economic and political consequences would be too severe. The Guild had leverage over everyone, because everyone needed spice, but the Guild needed it most. This mutual dependency created what seemed like a stable equilibrium. The Guild maintained enormous reserves of spice, stockpiles sufficient to operate for years without new harvests. This buffer protected them against short-term disruptions. If production on Arrakis temporarily halted due to political upheaval or natural disaster, the Guild could continue operations using their reserves while the situation stabilized. They weren't vulnerable to brief interruptions, only to sustained cutoffs that would exhaust their stockpiles. They also paid close attention to Arrakis politics. Guild observers watched the planet constantly. Guild representatives maintained relationships with whatever house held the fief. The Guild had financial interests in Chom, which managed much of the spice distribution. They were positioned to see problems developing and to apply pressure to ensure those problems didn't threaten production. What they didn't anticipate was someone who could see the same prescient futures they perceived. Someone who understood the Guild's dependency as clearly as they understood it themselves, and who possessed both the means and the willingness to weaponize that dependency against them. The Guild's navigators, for all their prescient ability, had a fundamental limitation. Their vision was focused on navigation, on safe paths through fold space, on economic trends and political dynamics and those factors affected as those factors affected their operations. They weren't Kwisatz Haderach, the prophesied being who could see all possible futures, all nexus points, all causal chains extending forward and backward through time. They couldn't see Paul Atreides coming. Or rather, they could see him in the vague, probabilistic way they saw all political actors. But they couldn't perceive what made him different, what made him dangerous in ways that no other political figure had ever been dangerous to the Guild. They saw a young duke who inherited a fief on Arrakis. They saw political maneuvering, the usual games of great houses competing for advantage. They saw the patterns they'd observed hundreds of times before. What they didn't see was that this young duke was developing prescient abilities that would eventually surpass even their own. That he was learning the ways of Arrakis from the Fremen. That he was positioning himself not to harvest spice, but to threaten its very existence. That he understood their vulnerability and was prepared to exploit it in ways that violated every assumption about rational behavior that the Guild depended on. The spice, that cinnamon-scented powder that made civilization possible, was about to become a weapon. And the Guild, for all their foresight, for all their careful political positioning, for all their wealth and power and seemingly unassailable monopoly, was about to learn that dependency is another word for vulnerability, and that leverage works both ways. The Muad'Dib Gambit, Paul's leverage. When Paul Atreides arrived on Arrakis as the young heir to Duke Leto, the Guild barely noticed. The Atreides replacing the Harkonnens was just another rotation of imperial favor, another great house being given their chance to profit from and be corrupted by the spice trade. The Guild had seen this pattern repeat across centuries. Nothing about it seemed particularly noteworthy. What they couldn't see, what their limited prescience couldn't reveal, was that Paul Atreides was something unprecedented. He was the product of millennia of Bene Gesserit genetic manipulation, born one generation earlier than the sisterhood had planned. His mother, Jessica, was supposed to bear a daughter who would marry a Harkonnen heir, and their son would become the Kwisatz Haderach, the being who could access both male and female genetic memories, who could see all possible futures, who could be in many places at once. Jessica, out of love for Duke Leto, had disobeyed her orders and born a son instead. That son, through a combination of genetics and circumstance and the prescient awareness granted by massive spice exposure, became the Kwisatz Haderach, ahead of schedule. Paul's prescient vision grew to encompass not just probable futures, but the vast network of causality that connected all moments, all decisions, all consequences. He saw the threads of time itself and learned to navigate them. When House Atreides was betrayed, when Duke Leto was killed and their forces scattered, Paul and Jessica fled into the desert. They found refuge with the Fremen, the native people of Arrakis who had adapted to the brutal environment of the desert planet, who could ride sandworms, who possessed knowledge about the deep desert that no Offworlder understood. Among the Fremen, Paul became Muad'Dib, a messianic figure whose coming had been prophesied by the Bene Gesserit Missionaria Protectiva, a program designed to plant protective religious legends across the Imperium. Paul's prescient abilities, enhanced by the water of life, a poisonous substance produced by drowning a young sandworm that Jessica transmuted into something a human could survive, expanded to encompass all possible futures. He saw the jihad that would sweep across the universe in his name. He saw billions dying under the banner of Muad'Dib. He saw himself as emperor, as a religious figure, as a tyrant, despite his intentions. And he saw something else, something crucial. He saw the guild's dependency on spice and understood how that dependency could be weaponized. The turning point came when Paul needed to force the emperor to acknowledge him, to grant him legitimacy, to hand over power without the prolonged civil war that Paul's prescient vision showed would devastate the Imperium. He needed leverage against the most powerful political and military force in human civilization. And he found it in the simplest, most elegant threat imaginable. He would destroy the spice. Paul understood what the Fremen had known for generations, but what off-worlders had never realized. The sandworms and the spice were connected in an ecological cycle. The worms weren't just creatures that happened to live on the same planet where spice was found. They were essential to spice production. Kill the worms and you kill the spice. And Paul, leading the Fremen who knew how to ride worms, who understood their behavior and life cycle, possessed the means to do exactly that. More than that, Paul understood something even more fundamental. Introducing water to Arrakis on a massive scale would transform the planet. The Fremen's secret dream was to terraform Arrakis, to create a paradise with open water, with plants, with a climate that wasn't trying to kill them every moment of every day. But this paradise would be fatal to the sandworms. The worms couldn't survive in a water-rich environment, and without the worms, no more spice, ever. This was leverage of a kind the Guild had never faced. Previous threats to spice production had been temporary. Sabotage, political instability, wars that might damage harvesting equipment. These were problems that could be solved, disruptions that could be endured using the Guild stockpiles until production resumed. But Paul's threat was permanent and total. He wasn't threatening to interrupt spice production. He was threatening to end it forever, to eliminate the source itself, to ensure that when the stockpiles ran out, there would be no more melange anywhere in the universe. When Guild representatives finally understood what Paul was proposing, they were horrified. Their prescient navigators, turning their awareness toward Arrakis, saw the branching futures. In some paths, Paul carried out his threat. In those futures, the Guild died. Their navigators expired as spice reserves were exhausted. Fold space travel ended. The Imperium fragmented into isolated worlds. Civilization collapsed into darkness. Everything the Guild had built over 10,000 years evaporated because one young man was willing to commit what amounted to cosmic vandalism on an unimaginable scale. The key to Paul's leverage was credibility. The Guild had to believe he would actually do it, that this wasn't a bluff or empty rhetoric. And Paul, with his prescient awareness, knew exactly how to demonstrate credibility. He showed them the futures where he carried through. He proved his willingness to accept the terrible consequences of his threat. He made clear that he wasn't a rational actor in the way they understood rationality. He was willing to destroy the foundation of civilization to achieve his goals. This was the masterstroke of Paul's strategy. The Guild's entire security framework was built on the assumption of rational self-interest. No one would destroy spice because doing so would destroy themselves, along with everyone else. It would be suicide. But Paul had seen futures where he died, where he was assassinated, or overthrown, or consumed by the forces he'd unleashed. He'd made his peace with mortality. He wasn't deterred by threats to his own survival, because he'd already accepted the possibility of his own death as part of the price of his vision. Moreover, Paul's prescience let him see something the Guild's navigators couldn't. He saw that their dependency gave him more leverage over them than their monopoly gave them over him. The Guild needed spice to survive. Paul controlled Arrakis. This created an asymmetry where Paul could threaten the Guild's existence, but the Guild couldn't effectively threaten him. They could refuse him transport, but that wouldn't stop him from ordering the destruction of spice production. They could support his enemies, but that would only accelerate the timeline toward the outcome they feared. The Guild found themselves in an impossible position. They had to choose between supporting Paul's claim to the throne or watching him destroy the substance that their entire existence depended on. It wasn't a real choice. They had to capitulate. They had to use their influence to pressure the Emperor. They had to transport Paul's forces when he needed transport. They had to become, in effect, tools of Paul's ambition, because the alternative was extinction. The scene where this played out was remarkable for its stark simplicity. Paul, now styled as the Emperor Paul Atreides, Muad'Dib, Lisan al-Gaib, held court with representatives of all the major powers. The Guild sent a delegation, navigators and officials who arrived expecting to negotiate, to find some compromise that would protect their interests. Instead, they found themselves facing an ultimatum. Paul made his position clear. He would rule. The Guild would support him. And in exchange, spice production would continue. But if they opposed him, if they worked against his interests, if they attempted to use their monopoly power to constrain him, he would order the destruction of every sandworm on Arrakis. The Fremen, fanatically loyal to Muad'Dib, would carry out this order without hesitation. The Guild would have perhaps 5 years of operations remaining before their stockpiles were exhausted. Then their navigators would begin dying, and their monopoly would become meaningless, because they would no longer be able to provide the service they monopolized. The Guild representatives tried to argue, tried to explain that destroying spice would destroying the Imperium itself. Paul agreed. He showed them that he understood the consequences perfectly, that he saw the futures where billions died in the chaos that would follow. And he made clear that he would accept those consequences if necessary, that his vision demanded he rule, and that he would destroy civilization itself rather than compromise on this point. It was the most audacious act of leverage in human history. A single individual, barely into his 20s, held hostage the most powerful economic entity ever created. He didn't threaten violence against the Guild's personnel. He didn't attack their ships or sabotage their operations. He simply made clear that he could and would eliminate the resource they depended on. and that realization gave him power over them that no military force could match. The guild capitulated. They transported Paul's forces to the confrontation with the emperor. They used their political influence to smooth his ascension. They accepted his terms because they had no alternative. Their 10,000-year monopoly, their carefully cultivated neutrality, their proud independence from political entanglements, all of it collapsed in the face of one man's willingness to threaten what had always seemed unthreatable. Paul became Emperor Paul Muad'Dib Atreides, ruler of the known universe, with the guild's reluctant but absolute support. The three-legged stool had been kicked over and rebuilt, with Paul sitting at its center. The guild remained essential to civilization's functioning, but they were no longer the independent arbiter of interstellar commerce. They were now, in effect, operating with Paul's permission, their monopoly continuing only because Paul allowed it to continue, their navigators alive only because Paul chose not to order their destruction. This was the moment when the guild learned the hard lesson that all monopolies eventually face. Dependency is a two-way street. They had made civilization dependent on them, yes, but in doing so, they had made themselves dependent on the continued functioning of that civilization. They needed the economy they served. They needed the political stability they'd carefully maintained. And most of all, they needed the spice that only one planet could provide. Paul had found the crack in the foundation and driven a wedge into it with precision that only perfect prescience could provide. He hadn't destroyed the guild. That would have been wasteful and unnecessary. He had simply made them understand that their power existed at his sufferance, that their independence was an illusion he could dispel whenever he chose. The guild continued to operate under Paul's reign and beyond, but they were never quite the same. The myth of their invulnerability had been shattered. Every navigator swimming in their orange tanks knew that their existence depended on the continued goodwill of forces beyond their control. The spice would flow, but it would flow at the pleasure of whoever controlled Arrakis, and that control they now understood with terrible clarity was something they couldn't guarantee, no matter how powerful their monopoly seemed. The long decline, twilight of the navigators. Paul's reign transformed the Imperium in ways that would echo for millennia. His Fremen jihad swept across human space, bringing his religious empire to thousands of worlds. But perhaps the most significant long-term change was what happened to the Guild. They continued to operate, continued to provide fold space transport, continued to appear as powerful and essential as ever. But the underlying reality had shifted fundamentally. The Guild had been exposed. Their absolute dependency on spice was now common knowledge among the highest echelons of power. Paul had demonstrated that this dependency could be weaponized, and once that knowledge existed, it could never be forgotten. Future rulers, future political actors, future revolutionaries would all remember that the Guild could be controlled through threats to spice production. But the more immediate impact came from Paul's son, Leto II, who became known as the God Emperor. Leto took his father's strategy to its ultimate conclusion. Where Paul had threatened to destroy spice, Leto actually controlled it with absolute precision. He transformed himself into a human sandworm hybrid, living for thousands of years directly managing spice production, parceling it out in carefully measured quantities designed to ensure his own political objectives. Under Leto's rule, the Guild found themselves even more constrained than they had been under Paul. Leto controlled not just Arrakis, but the sandworms themselves, understanding their biology and ecology more intimately than anyone else ever had. He used spice as a tool of political control, granting larger allocations to factions that served his purposes, restricting supply to those who opposed him. The Guild received what they needed to continue operations, but no more. Their stockpiles were deliberately kept low enough that they could never accumulate the reserves necessary to survive a sustained cutoff. Leto's reign lasted 3,500 years, a period called the Golden Path, during which he deliberately suppressed technological innovation and political change to enforce a stagnation that he claimed was necessary for humanity's survival. During this immense span of time, the Guild remained functional, but increasingly frustrated by their subservient position. They chafed under Leto's control, but could do nothing about it. Their navigators saw futures where they opposed him and saw themselves dying as he withheld spice in retaliation. The true decline of the Guild began when Leto's plan reached its culmination. His death triggered the Scattering, a diaspora where humans fled beyond the Imperium's borders, using spice reserves that Leto had deliberately allowed to accumulate. The sandworms that had been contained within Leto's body spread across Arrakis, multiplying and eventually being transplanted to other worlds. Spice production, once confined to a single planet, became distributed across multiple locations. This should have weakened the leverage that control of Arrakis had given Paul and Leto. With multiple sources of spice, no single authority could threaten the Guild's supply as effectively. But by this point, something more fundamental had changed. The technological prohibition against computers had begun to erode. The Ixians, masters of forbidden technology, had developed navigation computers that could potentially replace Guild navigators. These machines didn't violate the strictures against thinking machines in the most technical sense. They didn't possess consciousness or independent thought, but they could perform the calculations necessary to navigate fold space, could process the quantum uncertainties, could find safe paths without requiring prescient human awareness. They weren't as good as guild navigators initially. They had higher failure rates, less reliability, more limitations, but they were an alternative, and that alone was revolutionary. The Guild fought against this technology desperately. They used their political influence to lobby for strict enforcement of the prohibition on thinking machines. They argued that Ixian navigation computers violated the ancient commandment against building machines in the likeness of human minds. They threatened economic retaliation against any party that adopted the new technology. But the momentum of change was unstoppable. The Guild's monopoly, which had seemed eternal, which had persisted for more than 13,000 years since its founding, began to crack. Some factions started using Ixian navigators for less critical transport. Independent operators acquired the technology and offered cut-rate services that undercut Guild fees. The economics that had sustained the monopoly began to shift as alternatives emerged. The navigators themselves faced an existential crisis. Their entire identity was built around being irreplaceable, around possessing abilities that normal humans couldn't match. The idea that machines could do their job, even imperfectly, struck at the core of their self-understanding. They had sacrificed their humanity, had transformed themselves into something grotesque and beautiful and terrible, all for a function that was supposed to be uniquely theirs. And now that uniqueness was threatened. Some navigators descended into despair. Others became radicalized, demanding that the Guild take more aggressive action against the Ixians. Still others began questioning the entire foundation of their existence. If machines could navigate, had their transformation been necessary? Had they mutilated themselves for nothing? These were questions with no comfortable answers. The Guild tried to adapt. They attempted to improve their services, to compete on quality and reliability rather than pure monopoly. They invested in research to enhance navigator abilities further. They formed partnerships with the Ixians, trying to integrate rather than fight against the new technology. But these were rearguard actions, attempts to preserve influence in a changing landscape, rather than maintaining the absolute dominance they'd once enjoyed. By the time of the events described in Frank Herbert's later novels, the Guild was diminished but not destroyed. They remained important, still provided crucial services, still operated highliners throughout human space, but they were now just another powerful organization, competing with others, subject to political pressures, vulnerable in ways they had never been during the height of their power. The arc of the Guild's story is in many ways the arc of every monopoly. Every organization that achieves such dominance that it appears eternal. They began with a genuine innovation, a breakthrough that made them essential. They parlayed that essential status into political and economic power. They maintained their monopoly through careful management and political wisdom. But ultimately, they were undone by dependency, by technological change, and by the simple fact that nothing lasts forever. The navigators, those tragic beings swimming in their tanks of orange spice gas, represented something profound about the nature of power and sacrifice. They had given up everything human to achieve a function that seemed indispensable. They had transformed themselves into living tools, perfect for their purpose, but incapable of being anything else. And in the end, even that sacrifice wasn't enough to guarantee their relevance. There's a melancholy to the guild's decline that Herbert captured with characteristic subtlety. These beings had achieved something extraordinary, had made interstellar civilization possible, had served humanity for thousands of years. But they were remembered not for their service, but for their vulnerability. Not for enabling the Imperium, but for being manipulated by Paul Atreides. Not for their sacrifices, but for their obsolescence. The Guild's legacy is complex. They proved that political neutrality could be a form of power, that essential infrastructure could provide influence without requiring direct rule. They demonstrated that monopolies, carefully managed, could persist for millennia. But they also showed that even the most entrenched power structures contain vulnerabilities, that dependency is always a potential weapon, and that technological change can render even the most essential services obsolete. In the universe of Dune, where so much revolves around prescient vision, around seeing possible futures and choosing among them, the Guild's story is fundamentally about the limits of that vision. Their navigators could see paths through space and time, could perceive dangers and opportunities that others missed. But they couldn't see or couldn't accept the ultimate danger, that their monopoly would end, that their transformation would be for nothing, that the function they'd mutilated themselves to perform would become unnecessary. The twilight of the navigators wasn't a sudden catastrophe, but a long, slow fade into diminished relevance. They persisted, but as shadows of what they had been, reminders of a power structure that had once seemed invincible, but had proven as mortal as everything else humanity created. Distance, contracts, and the leverage of need. As we reach the end of our journey through the Spacing Guild's history, it's worth stepping back to consider what this organization represents, not just within the universe of Dune, but as a parable about power, dependency, and the nature of essential services in any complex society. The Guild's story is fundamentally about leverage. They achieved their position through control of something absolutely necessary, something that everyone needed and no one else could provide. In an interstellar civilization scattered across light years, movement was everything. Trade, warfare, diplomacy, communication, all of it depended on the ability to travel between worlds. The Guild provided that ability, and their monopoly on it gave them leverage over every other power structure in human space. But leverage, as Paul Atreides understood, works both ways. The Guild's power over others through their monopoly created a corresponding dependency within themselves. They needed their navigators, who needed spice, which came from one planet. This chain of dependency meant that anyone who could credibly threaten any link in that chain had leverage over the entire Guild. Paul found that weak link and exploited it with devastating precision. The parallels to our own world are uncomfortable and obvious. We live in an age of monopolies, of essential services controlled by single entities or small groups of entities. Communications, energy, data, logistics, finance, all of these are increasingly dominated by organizations that have achieved positions analogous to the Guild's. They provide services we depend on absolutely. They've made themselves indispensable, and they wield enormous power as a result. But the lesson of the Guild is that this power is more fragile than it appears. Every monopoly has dependencies. Every essential service relies on resources, technologies, or social conditions that could change. The Guild seemed invincible for 10,000 years, but they fell to a single young man who understood their vulnerability and was willing to exploit it. There's also something poignant about the navigators themselves, about what they sacrificed and why. They transformed themselves completely, gave up their humanity in pursuit of a function that seemed eternally necessary. They became perfect for their role, but that perfection was a cage. When that role became threatened, when alternatives emerged, they had nothing else. They couldn't return to being human. They couldn't adapt to serve other purposes. They were trapped in the forms they'd chosen, prisoners of their own optimization. This speaks to broader questions about specialization and adaptation. In our rapidly changing world, what does it mean to transform yourself completely for a specific role? How do you balance becoming excellent at something specific against maintaining the flexibility to change if that specific thing becomes obsolete? The navigators chose perfection over adaptability, and they paid for that choice when perfection in their function was no longer enough. Frank Herbert, writing in the 1960s and beyond, was deeply concerned with ecological and social systems, with how complex webs of dependency created both stability and vulnerability. The Guild was his exploration of monopoly power, but it was also his meditation on symbiosis and parasitism, on how organizations integrate themselves into larger systems, on the difference between being essential and being immortal. The Guild was essential. For 13,000 years, they were the most essential organization in human civilization. But they weren't immortal. They persisted through a strategy of parasitic integration, attaching themselves to the body politic and feeding on it without draining it. But when the body changed, when new technologies emerged, when political realities shifted, the Guild couldn't adapt quickly enough to maintain their position. There's a warning here for every organization that achieves dominance, every entity that makes itself indispensable. The Guild did everything right according to the logic of their time. They were politically neutral, economically efficient, technologically superior. They managed their monopoly with wisdom and restraint. They avoided the temptation to rule directly. They understood that political empires were finite, while essential infrastructure could persist through regime changes. And yet they still declined because they couldn't anticipate Paul Atreides, couldn't predict the Ixian navigation computers, couldn't imagine a universe where their service wasn't necessary. Their prescience, for all its power, couldn't overcome the fundamental limitation that the future is always more contingent, more fragile, more subject to unexpected change than any model can capture. The Guild story also illuminates the nature of contracts and agreements in complex societies. The Imperium's three-legged stool was held together not by formal legal structures, but by mutual dependency and shared understanding. The Emperor, the Landsraad, and the Guild each needed the others, and that need created a balance that persisted for millennia. But this balance depended on certain assumptions remaining valid: that fold space travel required navigators, that spice came only from Arrakis, that no one would be willing to destroy spice, even if they could. When Paul challenged those assumptions, when he demonstrated willingness to do what everyone had assumed was unthinkable, the entire system of contracts and agreements proved to be built on foundations less solid than anyone had realized. The Guild's contracts guaranteed their monopoly, but those contracts were only as strong as the political and economic conditions that supported them. Change those conditions fundamentally enough, and the contracts became irrelevant. This is perhaps Herbert's deepest insight about power structures. They persist not because they're formally protected or legally enshrined, but because everyone involved believes they'll persist. The moment that belief is shaken, the moment someone demonstrates that the foundations are vulnerable, the entire edifice can collapse with startling speed. The Guild seemed invincible until Paul showed they weren't, and that demonstration alone was enough to diminish them permanently. As we close this exploration of the Spacing Guild, we're left with questions that resonate beyond the fictional universe of Dune. What makes power structures persist? What makes them collapse? How do dependencies become vulnerabilities? When is specialization a strength? And when is it a fatal weakness? What's the relationship between being essential and being secure? The Guild had answers to these questions, answers that sustained them for longer than most human civilizations have existed. But those answers eventually proved insufficient when faced with challenges they hadn't anticipated, changes they couldn't adapt to, dependencies they couldn't eliminate. The navigators, swimming in their tanks, seeing through space and time, represented humanity's attempt to transcend its limitations through transformation and sacrifice. They succeeded in that transcendence, achieved abilities that normal humans couldn't match, served purposes that seemed eternally necessary. But they learned, as perhaps we all eventually learn, that permanence is an illusion, that change is the only constant, and that even the most powerful monopolies, the most essential services, the most perfect adaptations, are temporary accommodations to conditions that will eventually change. The Guild's legacy endures not in their continued dominance, which faded, but in what they represented and what their story teaches. They showed that power without political ambition could be more enduring than power pursued through traditional conquest. They demonstrated that neutrality, carefully maintained, could be a position of strength rather than weakness. They proved that essential infrastructure, skillfully managed, could provide influence that rivaled or exceeded military might. But they also revealed the vulnerabilities inherent in any monopoly, the dangers of singular dependency, The risks of transforming yourself so completely for a specific function that you lose the ability to be anything else. Their story is a tragedy of optimization, of beings who made themselves perfect for a role that they believed would last forever, only to discover that forever is much shorter than it appears from within a stable system. The orange tanks, the transformed bodies, the prescient vision navigating through folded space. All of it represents a bargain that humanity made with itself. Sacrifice the human to achieve the superhuman. Give up form and flexibility to gain function and power. For 13,000 years, that bargain seemed worthwhile. The Guild enabled civilization, made the Imperium possible, connected scattered worlds into a coherent whole. But when the technological landscape shifted, when Ixian computers offered an alternative, when Paul's threat exposed their fundamental vulnerability, the terms of that bargain changed. The sacrifice remained, but its value diminished. The navigators were still superhuman, but their superhuman abilities were no longer quite as necessary as they once had been. They had traded everything to become indispensable, and then discovered that nothing is truly indispensable if alternatives can be found or created. In the quiet moments between fold space jumps, in the timeless space of the navigator tanks where past and future blur together, perhaps the navigators contemplated their fate. They had seen so far, perceived so much, understood the fundamental patterns of space and time, but they hadn't seen or hadn't been able to prevent their own diminishment. Their prescience, focused on navigation and economic stability, had blind spots that Paul Atreides exploited and that technological change eventually rendered fatal. The Guild persists in the later novels of Herbert's series, but as a changed entity, diminished in power, competing rather than dominating, subject to political forces rather than transcending them. The navigators still guide some ships through fold space, still serve their ancient function, but they do so in a universe where their monopoly has ended, where their transformation no longer guarantees relevance, where the sacrifices they made seem, in retrospect, perhaps excessive for a function that proved less eternally necessary than they'd believed. This is the final lesson of the Spacing Guild, that power, leverage, and necessity are all temporary conditions. The distances they conquered remained, but the means of conquering those distances changed. The contracts they negotiated still existed, but the balance of power those contracts reflected had shifted. The leverage they possessed through monopoly evaporated when that monopoly could no longer be maintained against technological alternatives and political pressures. The Guild's story arc, from revolutionary innovation through 10 millennia of dominance to gradual decline, mirrors the life cycle of every monopoly, every essential service, every power structure built on controlling something everyone needs. They rose through genuine innovation. They maintained their position through skill and wisdom. They fell not because they did anything wrong by the standards of their time, but because the conditions that made their monopoly possible eventually changed in ways they couldn't fully control or prevent. In Frank Herbert's vast meditation on power, ecology, religion, and human potential, The Spacing Guild serves as a reminder that even the most entrenched positions are vulnerable, that dependency flows in multiple directions, and that the leverage created by controlling necessity can be turned against those who wield it by anyone willing to threaten what seems unthreatable. The navigators swim on in their orange tanks, perceiving realities that normal humans will never see, performing functions that still matter, even if they matter less than they once did. They are living monuments to a choice made long ago, to sacrifice humanity for utility, to transform completely for a purpose that seemed eternal. And they are warnings to anyone who believes that their power, their position, their essential status will protect them from the tides of change that eventually erode every structure humanity builds. The spice still flows, though from multiple worlds now rather than just Arrakis. The highliners still move through fold space, though some now guided by machines rather than mutated humans. The guild still exists, still operates, still serves. But the universe they operate in has moved beyond them in fundamental ways. They remain, but as echoes of their former power, as reminders that nothing lasts forever, not even monopolies that seemed as permanent as the stars themselves. The broader implications, power and infrastructure. Before we conclude our deep dive into the Spacing Guild, it's worth exploring some of the broader themes that their story illuminates. Themes that extend beyond the fictional universe of Dune and speak to fundamental questions about power, infrastructure, and social organization in any complex civilization. The Guild represents what we might call infrastructural power, a form of influence that operates differently from traditional political or military might. They didn't rule populations, didn't command armies, didn't make laws or enforce them through force. Instead, they controlled the systems that made all those other forms of power possible. This is a particularly modern form of dominance, one that becomes more relevant as societies grow more complex and more dependent on specialized services and technologies. Consider the parallels in our contemporary world. Companies that control internet infrastructure, social media platforms, payment processing systems, or global logistics networks wield power that in many ways exceeds that of traditional political authorities. They can't arrest you or tax you, but they can exclude you from systems that are essential for participating in modern life. They operate across national boundaries, providing services that no single government can replicate, creating dependencies that transcend traditional political categories. The Guild perfected this model thousands of years before our current tech monopolies emerged. They understood that you didn't need to sit on a throne to exercise imperial levels of control. You just needed to make yourself indispensable, to position yourself as the infrastructure that everyone else depended on. This infrastructural power is more subtle than traditional authority, but it can be equally or more effective because it operates at a level where most people don't even think about it. When infrastructure works well, it becomes invisible. People don't think about the water system until the taps run dry. Don't consider the electrical grid until the power fails. Don't notice the transportation network until it breaks down. The Guild achieved this ultimate form of power, becoming so essential that they were essentially invisible, taken for granted like gravity or air, noticed only when something went wrong. But this invisibility creates its own vulnerabilities. When people take infrastructure for granted, they stop thinking about the entities that control it. Stop questioning whether alternatives might exist. Stop considering how dependent they've become. This can make infrastructural power very stable, but it also means that when challenges emerge, when alternatives appear, the transition can be rapid and dramatic because the dependency was never really conscious or examined. The Guild's neutrality was both genuine and strategic. By refusing to take sides in political conflicts, by serving all parties equally, they made themselves acceptable to everyone. No faction saw them as an enemy because they behaved like a utility rather than a political actor. This neutrality was crucial to maintaining their monopoly across thousands of years of political upheaval and regime change. But neutrality has costs. It means you can't pursue ideological goals, can't favor parties you might agree with, can't use your power to shape society according to your values. The Guild's neutrality was fundamentally conservative, in the sense that they worked to preserve the system as it existed, because that system enabled their operations. They had no interest in revolution or radical change, because such upheavals might threaten the stable conditions that supported their monopoly. This conservative bias is characteristic of infrastructural power. Companies that control essential systems generally oppose radical change because their business models depend on continuity. They may innovate within their domains, improving their services or expanding their offerings, but they resist changes to the fundamental structure that might threaten their position. The Guild exemplified this perfectly. They supported stability, discouraged disruption, and used their influence to maintain the status quo. Paul's exploitation of the Guild's spice dependency reveals another crucial aspect of infrastructural power. It's only as secure as the supply chains that support it. Modern infrastructure depends on complex webs of resources, technologies, and expertise. Disrupt any critical node in these networks and the entire system can collapse. The Guild learned this lesson catastrophically when Paul demonstrated that their monopoly on transportation made them absolutely dependent on the continued availability of spice. This is perhaps the central paradox of infrastructural power. The more essential you become, the more dependent you are on the conditions that allow you to provide that essential service. The Guild made themselves indispensable, but in doing so, they made themselves vulnerable to anyone who could threaten their ability to continue operating. They had leverage over everyone through their monopoly. but everyone also had potential leverage over them through the dependencies that monopoly created. The transformation of the navigators represents another dimension of this story: the costs of optimization. In our world, we increasingly see people and organizations optimizing themselves for specific functions, developing narrow expertise, sacrificing breadth for depth. This specialization creates tremendous efficiency and capability within specific domains, but it also creates brittleness, a lack of resilience when conditions change. The navigators were perfectly optimized for their function. They could navigate fold space with extraordinary precision, but they had sacrificed everything else to achieve this optimization. They couldn't do anything else, couldn't adapt to other roles, couldn't return to being generalists if their specialized function became less necessary. They were trapped by their own perfection, prisoners of an optimization that had seemed so rational when fold space navigation was the only method of interstellar travel. We face similar choices in our own lives and societies. Do we optimize for efficiency in current conditions? Or do we maintain flexibility for unknown futures? Do we specialize deeply? Or do we stay versatile? Do we make ourselves perfect for today's challenges? Or do we preserve the ability to adapt to tomorrow's? The navigator's fate suggests that optimization, taken to extremes, can be a trap. That perfection in one domain can mean vulnerability when that domain's relevance changes. The economic model of the Guild also deserves examination. They operated as what economists might call a natural monopoly, where the barriers to entry were so high and the economies of scale so significant that competition was effectively impossible. The knowledge required to create navigators, the infrastructure of highliners, the accumulated expertise and resources, all of these created barriers that prevented competitors from challenging their position. Natural monopolies are inherently unstable over long periods because they create such strong incentives for innovation around them. If one entity controls something essential and charges monopoly prices for it, enormous resources will eventually flow toward finding alternatives. The Guild maintained their monopoly for 13,000 years, which is extraordinary. But eventually, the Ixians developed navigation computers precisely because the potential rewards for breaking the Guild's monopoly were so tremendous. This suggests a general principle. Monopolies contain within themselves the seeds of their own disruption. The higher the prices, the greater the dependency, the more essential the service, the stronger the incentive for someone to find a way around it. The Guild's monopoly was so valuable that it essentially guaranteed that someone would eventually develop an alternative. They delayed this outcome for millennia through careful management and political influence, but they couldn't prevent it forever. The prescient abilities of the navigators add another layer of complexity to this analysis. They could see probable futures, could perceive threats and opportunities before they fully materialized. This should have given them an insurmountable advantage, allowing them to anticipate and prevent challenges to their monopoly. Yet they still declined. still faced disruption they couldn't fully prevent. This reveals something profound about the limitations of foresight. The navigators could see many futures, but they couldn't control which future would manifest. They could perceive the threat of Ixian computers, but they couldn't prevent the Ixians from developing that technology. Without actions that would have violated their neutrality and triggered exactly the kind of political resistance they sought to avoid. Their prescience showed them dangers, but didn't always provide solutions that were politically and practically feasible. This mirrors our own situation with predictive capabilities. We have sophisticated models for projecting economic trends, demographic changes, technological developments, climate shifts. But having these projections doesn't automatically give us the power to change outcomes, especially when the required changes would disrupt powerful interests or require coordination across competing factions. The Guild could see their decline coming, but couldn't find a path that prevented it while maintaining the core principles that had sustained them for millennia. The relationship between the Guild and the Bene Gesserit is also instructive. Both were ancient organizations that persisted through regime changes by making themselves essential. But they operated very differently. The Bene Gesserit worked through indirect influence, through genetic manipulation and careful placement of their members in positions where they could whisper in the ears of power. The Guild operated through direct control of essential services, through monopoly rather than manipulation. Both approaches had strengths and weaknesses. The Bene Gesserit's indirect methods made them less visible as a threat, but also gave them less direct control over outcomes. The Guild's monopoly gave them tremendous direct power, but also made them a more obvious target for anyone seeking to challenge existing power structures. Neither approach proved foolproof against someone like Paul, who combined prescient vision with political ruthlessness in ways neither organization had encountered before. These parallel organizations illustrate different strategies for long-term institutional survival. The Bene Gesserit model is about influence without visibility, about shaping events from the shadows. The Guild model is about becoming so essential that everyone depends on you, regardless of whether they like you. Both can work for millennia under the right conditions. Both eventually face challenges they can't fully overcome. The human cost, what the navigators lost. Throughout our exploration of the Spacing Guild, we've touched repeatedly on the navigators themselves, but it's worth spending more time considering what their transformation really meant, what they gave up, and whether that sacrifice could ever be justified. Imagine being selected for navigator training. You'd be told you were among the most gifted, that you'd been chosen for the highest honor the Guild could offer, that you'd become essential to civilization itself. You'd begin the training, learning the theoretical foundations, preparing mentally for what was to come, and then you'd enter the tanks. The transformation would be gradual, which might make it worse. You'd watch your body change in ways that couldn't be reversed. See yourself becoming something that wasn't quite human anymore. Your limbs would elongate, becoming spindly and strange. Your face would deform. your features shrinking or disappearing into something barely recognizable. Your skin would take on an unusual texture, adapted to the spice gas you'd breathe for the rest of your life. But the physical changes, disturbing as they were, might be less profound than the mental transformation. As the spice saturated your nervous system, as your brain adapted to processing prescient information, you'd begin perceiving reality in ways that normal humans couldn't imagine. Time would lose its linear quality. You'd see multiple probable futures simultaneously. Space would become navigable in dimensions that normal senses couldn't detect. This expanded awareness would be exhilarating at first. You'd understand things that had been mysteries. You'd perceive patterns in the chaos of quantum uncertainty. You'd feel connected to the fundamental forces that shaped reality. It would be like suddenly gaining new senses, like a blind person seeing for the first time, or a deaf person hearing, except multiplied beyond any ordinary sensory experience. But this expansion would come at the cost of ordinary human experiences. Food would become tasteless, except for the cinnamon scent of spice. Physical touch would mean less and less as your body existed more in the tank than in space that could be touched. Human conversation would become difficult because your mind would be operating in dimensions that words couldn't adequately describe. You'd become isolated, not just physically in your tank, but conceptually, in your awareness. You'd perceive so much more than normal humans that communication would become increasingly difficult. They'd seem limited, blind, trapped in narrow perception. You might pity them, or might envy them their ignorance, but you couldn't fully connect with them anymore. The transformation would have taken you beyond humanity in ways that couldn't be reversed or shared. The loneliness of this existence is difficult to fully appreciate. You'd be surrounded by other navigators in their tanks, other beings who shared your transformation. But would that be enough? Would perceiving the same cosmic patterns create real connection? Or would each navigator be ultimately alone in their expanded awareness, seeing the universe but unable to truly share that vision with anyone else? And you'd live for centuries in this state. The spice would extend your lifespan dramatically, meaning you'd spend hundreds of years in that tank, in that body, in that state of awareness. You'd watch normal humans live and die, generations passing while you remained unchanging, performing your function, perceiving your visions, existing in a temporal scale that made ordinary human concerns seem trivially brief. Would the experience be worth this sacrifice? The accounts we have from navigators suggest that many believed it was, that the transcendent nature of prescient awareness justified any cost. They experienced realities that normal consciousness couldn't access. They touched something approaching cosmic awareness. They served purposes that made civilizations possible. But others might have felt differently, might have experienced their transformation as a form of living death, a sacrifice that, in retrospect, seemed excessive for a function that, while important, was still just a job. They'd given up love, family, physical pleasure, normal human relationships, everything that makes life meaningful for most people, in exchange for being living tools. human components in a transportation system. The Guild's careful secrecy about the navigator's appearance suggests an awareness that normal humans would find the transformation disturbing. They kept the navigators hidden not just to protect trade secrets, but to avoid confronting the rest of humanity with what had been done, with what the navigators had become. There was shame in that secrecy, an acknowledgement that the transformation was grotesque, even if it was necessary. This raises uncomfortable questions about what we're willing to sacrifice for function, about how we value human dignity against utility. The navigators volunteered for their transformation, chose it consciously from what they understood about the process. But was that truly informed consent when they couldn't really know what the experience would be like until they'd undergone changes that couldn't be reversed? Modern parallels exist in less extreme forms. We make choices to specialize, to dedicate ourselves to careers or causes, to sacrifice aspects of our humanity for functions we believe are important. We might not transform our bodies as dramatically as the navigators, but we do transform our lives, our capabilities, our identities. We optimize ourselves for specific roles, sometimes discovering too late that the optimization cost us more than we realized. The difference is one of degree and reversibility. Most human optimization can be reversed or modified. You can change careers, can develop new skills, can reclaim aspects of life you'd previously sacrificed. The navigators couldn't. Their transformation was permanent, absolute, irreversible. Once they entered those tanks, once the changes progressed past certain thresholds, they could never go back to being simply human. This permanence is what makes their sacrifice so profound and so tragic. They weren't just choosing a career or a lifestyle. They were choosing to become something other than human, to transform so completely that return was impossible. And they were making that choice based on the belief that their function would always be necessary, that the sacrifice would always matter, that fold space navigation would always require beings like them. When Ixian computers emerged, when alternatives appeared, when their function became less exclusively theirs, what did that mean for the navigators who had sacrificed everything for that function? Their bodies remained transformed, their minds remained expanded, but the meaning of their sacrifice shifted. They'd given up humanity for a purpose that was no longer quite as necessary as it had been. How does one process that realization while existing in a form that can never be unmade? The tragedy of the navigators is that their sacrifice was real and profound, but its value proved contingent rather than absolute. They'd gambled their humanity on the proposition that fold space navigation would always require prescient beings, and they'd lost that gamble. Not immediately, not catastrophically, but gradually. As technology advanced and alternatives emerged, the terms of their sacrifice changed in ways they couldn't have fully anticipated. This is perhaps the deepest lesson in their story, that even sacrifices made with complete commitment and genuine necessity can prove, in retrospect, to have been based on assumptions that turned out to be temporary. The navigators were necessary for 13,000 years, which is extraordinary by any standard. But infinity is longer than 13,000 years, and they'd transformed themselves as if their necessity would be infinite. Closing thoughts. The echo of distance. As we reach the true conclusion of our journey through the Spacing Guild's history, we're left with images that linger in the mind. The enormous highliners hanging in orbit like man-made moons. The navigators in their orange tanks seeing through dimensions we can barely imagine. The moment when Paul Atreides threatened to destroy the spice and brought the most powerful monopoly in history to its knees. The slow decline as technology evolved and alternatives emerged. The Guild's story is woven throughout Frank Herbert's Dune series, sometimes in the foreground but more often in the background. The infrastructure that enables everything else to happen. They're the stage on which the drama plays out, the transportation system that makes the politics possible, the economic foundation that supports the Imperium civilization. Herbert gave us, through the Guild, a meditation on power that operates differently from traditional conquest or rule. They showed us that essential services can provide influence that exceeds military might, that neutrality can be a position of strength, that making yourself indispensable is a path to enduring power. But they also showed us the vulnerabilities inherent in this approach, the dependencies that monopoly creates, the ways that leverage can be turned against those who wield it. The distances between stars remain as vast as ever in the Dune universe. The need to cross those distances, to connect scattered worlds, to move goods and people and ideas across light years. That need persists regardless of who meets it or how. The Guild served that need for longer than most civilizations exist. They deserve credit for that achievement, even as we recognize the flaws and vulnerabilities that eventually diminished them. Their contracts, those agreements that governed the three-legged stool of imperial power, represented attempts to create stability through mutual dependency. For 10,000 years, those contracts held, modified and renegotiated countless times, but fundamentally intact. They created a political structure that, while far from perfect, prevented the kind of total warfare that would have destroyed interstellar civilization entirely. The leverage that the Guild possessed through their monopoly shaped the political landscape of the Imperium. Great houses negotiated with each other knowing that the Guild could facilitate or impede their movements. The Emperor exercised power knowing that the Guild could cut off his ability to project force. Everyone operated within constraints created by Guild policies and fees. This leverage maintained a balance that, while sometimes unjust, was at least predictable and manageable. When Paul seized control of Arrakis and threatened spice production, he demonstrated that even the most carefully constructed balances can be upset by someone willing to challenge fundamental assumptions. The contracts that had sustained the Guild's independence proved less permanent than anyone had believed. The leverage that had flowed from their monopoly reversed direction once Paul controlled what they needed most. This reversal didn't destroy the Guild immediately, but it fundamentally altered their relationship to power. They went from being independent arbiters to being, in effect, supplicants, continuing to operate, but always aware that their continued existence depended on political forces beyond their control. The proud neutrality that had defined them for millennia became a more hollow pose, maintained for form's sake, but lacking the substance it once possessed. The technological changes that followed Paul and Leto's reigns further eroded the Guild's position. When Ixian computers offered alternatives to navigator prescience, even imperfect alternatives, the monopoly that had seemed eternal revealed itself as vulnerable to innovation. The Guild adapted, competing where once they dominated, but the nature of their power had fundamentally changed. Through all of this, the navigators remained in their tanks, perceiving realities beyond normal human awareness, serving their function even as that function's exclusive nature eroded. They were living embodiments of commitments made long ago, transformations undertaken when the world was different, sacrifices whose meaning shifted as centuries passed. They persisted, but as echoes of what they'd been, reminders that even the most profound transformations serve purposes that prove more temporary than they appear. The story of the Spacing Guild reminds us that power structures, no matter how entrenched, are fundamentally fragile. They persist through combinations of capability, dependency, belief, and circumstance. Change any of these factors significantly enough and the structure transforms or collapses. The Guild had capability through their navigators, dependency through universal need for transport, belief in their permanent necessity, and circumstance of technological limitations that made alternatives impossible. When Paul weaponized their spice dependency, when Leto controlled spice production absolutely, when Ixians developed navigation computers, these factors changed. The capability remained, but it was no longer unique. The dependency continued, but it was no longer absolute. The belief in permanent necessity eroded as alternatives emerged, and circumstances shifted in ways that the Guild couldn't control or prevent, despite all their prescience and all their political wisdom. Yet even in decline, even diminished from their former power, the Guild continued to serve functions that mattered. They still connected worlds, still enabled trade and communication, still employed their navigators to guide ships through the folded dimensions of space. They proved that you don't have to maintain absolute power to remain relevant, that diminishment isn't the same as destruction, that institutions can persist in reduced forms, adapting to changed circumstances even when they can no longer dominate them. This resilience, this ability to continue serving purposes even after losing monopoly status, is perhaps the Guild's final lesson. Power structures don't always collapse completely when challenged. Sometimes they just transform, finding new equilibria, accepting reduced status, persisting in modified forms. The Guild lost its monopoly but didn't disappear. It adapted, survived, continued operating in a universe that had moved beyond needing them quite as desperately as it once had. As we drift away from the highliners, from the navigator tanks, from the vast network of commerce and transport that the Guild built and maintained, we're left with a complex legacy. They enabled an interstellar civilization, connected thousands of worlds, served essential functions for longer than we can easily comprehend. They made mistakes, revealed vulnerabilities, suffered decline, but they also achieved something remarkable. They made themselves indispensable for millennia, shaped the political and economic structure of human space, and left marks on civilization that persisted long after their dominance ended. The distances between stars remain. The contracts that govern how power flows between parties continue to be negotiated. The leverage that comes from controlling essential resources or services still shapes political outcomes. The Spacing Guild, in all its power and vulnerability, in its achievements and failures, in its transformation and decline, stands as one of science fiction's most sophisticated explorations of how infrastructure shapes civilization, how monopoly both enables and constrains, and how even the mightiest powers contain within themselves the seeds of their own diminishment. Thank you for joining me on this exploration of one of Dune's most fascinating, yet often overlooked institutions. If you enjoyed this deep dive into the Spacing Guild, their navigators, their highliners, and their ultimate vulnerability to threats they couldn't prevent despite all their prescience, please hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. It really helps me continue creating these detailed examinations of science fiction's richest universes. Until next time, may your own dependencies be recognized, your contracts be honored, and your leverage be carefully considered before you wield it. The spice must flow. But remember, whoever controls the spice controls the universe. And sometimes, the most powerful monopolies are the most vulnerable to those who understand what they truly need to survive. Sleep well and dream of distances conquered and futures glimpsed through eyes that see more than human vision allows. Good night.